Good evening and welcome to Multifamily Meetup Mondays. I'm your host for today. My name is Carlos Di Reynoso. Thank you so much for joining us today. We know that there's many things you could be doing on your Monday evenings, and we're proud that you've joined us today. We have a very special guest. Before we get into his presentation and introduction, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've been in real estate since 1999, originally started in Miami, Florida, moved over to Georgia in 2007 as a single family agent. And in 2007 and 2008, moved over to Georgia, and I've been doing single family here. And in the past 2 years, I've decided to switch over to multifamily. And in the past couple of months, I got invited to be a general partner on a deal in Shreveport, Louisiana, with two major groups here in the U.S. and especially in Georgia. So I am currently a general partner on a deal, and I'm currently in the process of raising money for that deal. So today I'm very excited to welcome a very special guest. He's been in the industry for quite some time in multifamily. He's a marketing and sales professional. He's also self-directed IRA and HSA expert. He's also a financial literacy expert and advocate. He's currently with Advanta IRA as a business development specialist, and we're very proud to have him on the guest today. So without further ado, let's welcome our guest for the day and presenter, Clay Malcolm. Clay, welcome to the show.
Hey, Carlos. Good to see you. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Clay. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, thank you. This is actually a re-recording. Clay was nice enough to join us to re-record the intro. So thank you once again for your time. And just if you would, Clay, briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing with Advanta IRA.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And I'll also maybe put my screen up here.
Sure.
Yeah, so I've been in the self-directed IRA space, for the last 10 years almost. And not only am I a self-directed IRA professional, but I'm also an IRA investor. I'm actually a real estate investor, both inside and outside my IRA. And so one of the great things about my job is that I get to not only experience what you guys are experiencing for myself, so I can really relate to what we're doing. I also get to learn a lot. So I get to join groups, share what I know, and learn what they know. So it's really been a great experience and a great position for me because I love real estate investing. And I also get to, tell people how to engage this tax advantage money that they have in real estate investing so that they can use their expertise in service of their retirement accounts. And for folks who are putting together a deal, they can use other people's IRA money to complete their financing. So really happy to be here, and we're going to talk about all of those details as we move through the presentation.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. That's a great introduction to yourself and what you got going on. So we really appreciate that. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the presentation. So thank you for that, Clay. And go ahead and get started with your presentation.
I gave you my extension and my email at the beginning. Please feel free to contact me, especially if you joined me today. I mean, let's, use me as a resource, whether you use us or whether you end up using IRAs a lot or not. If you have questions, I want you to have the information so that you can make the best decision for you. And we are dedicated to that with events and, again, training. We have a video library, a YouTube channel, our blogs. If there's ever some legislation like the CARES Act or the Secure Act or something like that you want to know about, please feel free to go on our website, which is advantira.com, and look at the blog because we will have a post about it. What do I need to know about this? How does it affect what's going on with my investment strategy? Those types of things we feel responsible for making sure that you have that information. The other thing I will mention is that we realize that we're in kind of an interesting position in as much as we work with a lot of investment issuers and syndicators and things like that. And we also work with a lot of investors. Now, by virtue of our business model, we're actually not allowed to put individual investors with individual investment issuers. But we do realize that we're kind of in that in-between space. So we do offer a Zoom meeting that's free for anybody. We're not making any money off of it, or there's nothing. We're a very neutral part of this equation, but it's called Pitch, Promote, and Prosper. It's every other Friday at noon Eastern time. So if you have an investment that you want to let people know about, you can do that. And if you have an investment that you're looking for, you can let people know about that. So if you're a syndicator out there and you have a deal going and you're looking for investors, you might be able to gather some by talking about your deal at this event. So one of the things that we realize is that there needs to be interaction between investors and investment issuers. So we try to fill that gap with kind of this neutral networking space. And again, we're not promoting any of these particular things. We're really just providing the space for people to get together and hear what's going on. Okay, so back to our focus on the materials today. So the two reasons, and I mentioned these earlier, that you would want to know about the fact that IRAs can invest in something other than Wall Street is for your own retirement savings. So if you have some expertise in real estate investing, or you're just not happy with let's say you have an old 401k at a company where you no longer work and it's not that 401k is not making very much money, or things like that, you have the ability to have that money be moved, no tax, no penalty, via a rollover or a transfer to a self-directed IRA and invest in real estate. And we're going to talk about all the options there, but you have more control than you may understand, I guess is my point about this. So we're going to talk about what types of control you have on your IRA and how you can utilize that to get the best returns. And also for the second point that I have down there, again, raising money for your deals. So if you are the head of syndication or putting one together, or a fund that invests in real estate in one way or another, you actually can raise money from other people's IRA. And the really cool thing about that from my perspective in this business is that everybody gets to win and nobody really has to lose, right? So the IRA holder is looking for good solid returns on their investment. And the syndicator is looking for funds to bring into their project so they can accomplish that and take it to a successful completion and pay off their investors and make some money themselves. So those two things are not in competition with one another. And us as an IRA, we're a self-directed IRA provider, which means we provide the account. But again, we don't give any tax, legal, or investment advice. We're not there to tell you what to do or when to buy or sell or any of that kind of thing. Our role is very similar to hiring somebody to do your taxes. You're hiring us to do the administration on an account, traditional IRA, Roth IRA, etc. But that account, because we know how to do the administration and bookkeeping, can buy and sell assets that your bank or brokerage house IRA won't let you, right? So Schwab or Fidelity or your bank, they say, yes, we'll be the custodian for your IRA. But while your IRA is with us, it can only buy and sell publicly traded securities because we make a commission on it and that's our business. That's what we know. Well, Advanta IRA takes a different approach. We say, look, we don't sell any investments. We're not going to give you any advice, but we will house your account and be the custodian for that, such that you get to keep the tax advantages, but that it can invest in alternative assets. So you get to participate in real estate. So that's really how we come at it. And this is the reason why I think for anybody tuned in today, you have two kind of possibilities for utilizing this information base for your real estate investing. And so just to be clear, there's the term self-directed is really just a marketing term. All it really means is that the IRA holder, whoever it is that account owner, has the ability to make choices about what that account buys and sells, right? So the account types themselves they stay the same. So traditional IRA, Roth IRA, a solo 401k. Often people don't realize that their health savings account can also be invested in this manner. So it is an individual custodial account as well. It's very common for somebody to have an old 401k or a 403b. thrift savings plan, something like that, at an employer where they no longer work. And those accounts are automatically eligible to be able to be rolled over to another IRA without tax and without penalty. You're really just moving it from one custodial entity to another. So the IRS doesn't tax or penalize that. It's all still under the tax umbrella. But it's these accounts, these same ones that you're familiar with, that are going to buy and sell. Instead of stocks and bonds, they're going to buy and sell real estate or participate in a syndication and receive the dividends from that syndication. So the only thing that really changes is the investment itself. The contribution rules are the same, the distribution rules are the same. The only thing that's really changing is what that account purchases while it has its tax advantages. So all these accounts are available for your IRA, and they're all can be self-directed as long as you have them at a custodian that handles alternative assets. Now, when I say alternative assets, that's kind of a funny thing because I don't think of real estate as being particularly alternative, but let's talk specifically about the possibilities. So an IRA can invest in all kinds of real estate. So it can be single family residential, commercial, warehouses. There's people who do fix and flips in their IRA. Certainly syndications is what we're going to focus on today. So that's usually some sort of private equity arrangement, right? So somebody has a relatively large real estate project. They gather some investors, they do some work on it, or in some other way they manipulate that property. They buy it and resell it, or rent, hold it for rent. And then the investors get paid off as participants in that overall investment scheme. So the thing that you are talking about here is really, in essence, a little bit of a private equity, but it's still real estate. It's real estate backed, right? That's the core operation of that entity. But going back to the list, so condos, duplexes, REITs, raw land. My IRAs have owned a single family rental, some raw land. I've made loans to fix and flippers, and those are the types of arrangements that I've been in so far. But I was talking to Carlos before the presentation. I'm much more focused on multifamily these days for a couple of reasons, and so it's been interesting to I get to present information a lot, but I also learn a lot from the groups that I'm in. So it's a great trade-off for me, at least. Oh, and I will go back to this real quickly. So debt leverage is actually part of the equation when it comes to IRA investing. So if your IRA does not have the full purchase amount, or let's say you're a syndicator and you're going to use debt to purchase the real estate, that is completely allowable from an IRS perspective. Now, there are some things that you need to know about that, but your IRA does not need to have the whole purchase price of a particular piece of real estate. I know that my IRA, when I bought a small single family rental, I didn't have the full purchase price, so I got a loan to supplement my IRA's cash balance. So that is completely acceptable from an IRS perspective, and we'll get into a little more detail about that. Some of the real estate investments that are more paper centric, for lack of a better way to put it, are tax liens, tax deeds, certainly almost any kind of note. It's interesting that the IRS allows your IRA to be a lender. It also allows your IRA to buy existing notes, and it also allows your IRA to purchase a position in a syndication that is using debt leverage to extend its buying power. Options, accounts receivable, there are all kinds of paper assets that the IRS is totally fine with your IRA purchasing and making money from and keeping its tax advantages. Again, really the only thing that you need to do to activate that is have your account at a custodian that handles those types of assets, because that can be different. And then there's all kinds of other creative assets that are out there. I know that, we've seen people with movie projects, racehorse syndications, futures, commodities, all kinds of things like that. So almost anything that you know how to make money at outside your IRA, you can make money at inside your IRA, as long as you take the time to set it up properly, and you do have to follow a few rules that we're going to talk about. But In terms of how do you get tax advantaged money to make the most money, my message to you, if there's nothing else that you take away from today, is that tax advantaged money can invest in all kinds of things, and it can be something that you're an expert at in a real estate sense. So please understand that money is available to be an investor in real estate, and can be an active investor as well. Okay, so I mentioned that there's a few rules that you kind of have to keep in mind when you're talking about IRA money. And one of them is something called self-dealing. And these rules basically revolve around the idea that there are certain people, a very small group of people called disqualified persons, you can see it on the screen there, that have some restrictions in the way that they interact with the IRA's cash and assets. So those disqualified persons are the account holder and their spouse, ascendants and descendants, and the descendant spouses. So me as the account holder, my spouse, my parents, my grandparents, my kids, my grandkids, and the kids and grandkids as spouses. That lineal ascendancy and descendancy, they have some restrictions, and we'll talk about what those restrictions are. They're called prohibited transactions on the next slide. But that's a very small group of people, right, that I have restrictions about. And it is actually not all family members. So my brother, so siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, they are not disqualified persons. So if you ever hear, you'll often hear somebody say, oh, self-directed IRAs, they have some possibilities, but you can't use your family members or participate with them. And that's actually not the case in a couple of different ways. So it's always good to ask questions about that. But the list of self-directed IRA disqualified persons is basically your lineal ascendancy and descendancy. And the restrictions that they have in terms of participation are, generally speaking, that your IRA can't buy from any of those people anything that they already own, and you can't sell to them. Your IRA cannot sell a property that it owned to your parents, let's say. Credit arrangements. So your IRA could not loan money to any of those disqualified persons, nor receive a loan from any of those disqualified persons. Nor can your IRA be used as collateral for a loan that any of those people take out. So almost any kind of debt or leverage situation, those people who are disqualified persons have some restrictions about. I think one of the biggest bummers, for lack of a more technical term, bummers about disqualified persons is that they're not allowed to actually take use of an asset that your IRA owns, nor are they allowed to provide services for it. And so as real estate investors, what that really means is, if my IRA owns a property, even just a piece of an apartment building, I can't, let's say, rent one of those apartments to my son. And I can't have my son go over there and work on that property, increase its value, because the IRS sees that as, oh, that's really kind of a contribution to your IRA. We don't know how to tax it. It makes us nervous, so we're just going to prohibit that. So providing services and taking use of the property are two of the prohibitions that the IRS puts on that list of disqualified persons. And you can see some specific manifestations of it here on the screen, but I would say that from a conceptual perspective, what you're thinking about is those people, there's not really any purchase, buy and sell, credit arrangements, personal services, or use of those properties. Those are the general rules that really apply when it comes to your IRA owning real estate. But like I said, it's not all family members, and that leaves everybody else in the world as a non-disqualified person, so they do not have those restrictions. So your IRA can buy or sell to or from anybody else in the world except for that very small list of people. Same thing with lending money, same thing with other credit arrangements, same thing with, somebody taking use of it. So there are some restrictions, so I just point those out so that you don't get run afoul of the rules right off the bat. One of the things I put in this presentation specifically that I wanted to mention to everybody is simply a note about traditional to Roth conversions. Your old 401k or your traditional IRA or your SEP IRA or simple IRA, those are all in the the traditional IRA tax format, meaning that the contributions are pre-tax. While the money is in the account, it's tax deferred, and then you would take, when you take distribution, then it's taxed at that point. Roth, on the other hand, is flips the switch on that. So your post-tax money in, still tax deferred in the middle, but there's no tax on the distributions as long as they're qualified distributions. And you can switch horses, for lack of a better way to put it, midstream. So you can take the money that you have in a traditional IRA and you can convert it to Roth. And there is a tax event that's associated with that, with whatever the gross amount. So let's say I wanted to convert $10,000 from my traditional to my Roth. In that tax year that I make the conversion, $10,000 would get added to my income tax, to my earned income for that year. So I would pay tax on it. So it's not free, but it's not penalized either. It's really just taxed. And the reason that I bring this up is because there's so much talk about income tax rates being low at this point, and things like that. So whether you decide to use this information today or 20 years from now, it doesn't matter to me. I just want you to make aware that in this day and age, you actually have no restrictions on how much you can convert from traditional to Roth. So that can be a really powerful tool, and it's something that I recommend you talking to your CPA or your tax person about, because those rules can change and income tax rates can change. But if we're at a low ebb, there is incentive in terms of the income tax rates, there is an incentive to make a conversion now, because that means that any taxation later, either on that money or the money that it earns, could be tax-free. So that tool I want you to just be aware of, and if you have questions, more specific questions, we can talk about that as we go through the process, the presentation today. Next thing I wanted to just point out, because it's asked a lot about when it comes to real estate, is LLCs within your IRA. So let me start by saying this. Many syndications are housed, so to speak, within an LLC. So if I'm the syndicator, or the primary person in the deal, excuse me, I might form an LLC, make myself the manager or the managing member, and then each of my investors, whether they're IRAs or not, buy into the LLC. And then the LLC, because it is a legal and financial entity, goes out and purchases the property and does whatever fix up or manages it, or whatever that process is. So LLCs are absolutely allowed as assets within your IRA. So your IRA could be the 10% owner of Clay's LLC that is buying 123 Main Street apartment building. So that is absolutely allowable. The thing that I think that is kind of a misperception in some cases is that you actually have to have an LLC as a subset of your IRA in order to invest in a syndication. That's not the case. So your IRA is also a legal and financial entity, separate from your personal finances, and it can invest in an LLC or in a partnership, obviously in a C corporation, things like that. It actually cannot invest in an S corporation. That's really more of an S corporation rule than anything else. But almost all other entities that are accumulating investor funds, your IRA can be an investor in without having an LLC of its own. Now, there is something out there called checkbook control, which is essentially your IRA purchases, an LLC gets created, and your IRA purchases an LLC 100%. So your IRA is 100% owner of Clay's LLC. And then I can name myself the manager of that LLC. So all of a sudden, in one hand, I have a check of IRA money made out to Clay's LLC, because that's the purchase price for that 100% share. And on the other hand, I have the state document saying that I am the manager of that LLC. So I can actually go down to a bank, open a business checking account, and be writing checks on my own IRA money. Now, understand this, the LLC in this setup does not absolve you from any of the rules. So all the disqualified person and prohibited transaction rules that I talked about a little bit ago, that still applies to that money. The thing that's nice about it is that there's some flexibility in terms of the speed with which you, pay vendors or purchase an asset or things like that. So if you're looking into your IRA money moving quickly as it gets in and out of investments, you might want to ask about checkbook control. And again, I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you at your convenience if you want to know more about that. But understand this, that LLCs are a possibility as a subset of your IRA or as an asset, but not required from an IRS perspective. Okay, so now let's focus a little bit on IRAs as they are participants in syndications. So why would IRA money be, in some cases, even preferable to personal money when it comes to investors? Well, there's a few things. One is IRA money, because of the way that the contribution and distribution rules are set up, particularly the distribution rules, means that somebody who is an investor who has an IRA in their 40s, they may not be terribly interested in that money producing returns until they're in their 60s, which means that not necessarily that they're not looking for a great investment. They are, believe me. But what they may be able to do is have that money be engaged for a longer period of time without being very nervous about the cash returns. So it is certainly possible that on certain projects, the cash returns are a little bit delayed, or the strategy is a more long-term one. So sometimes that makes IRA investors a really valuable tool for the syndicator. The other one is that, IRA holders are often investors in their own right with their personal money. So it's not uncommon for somebody who's a syndicator to be talking to a single person, but be talking to two investors. It's that person's personal finances, but also their IRA finances. And they are kept separate. And the reason they're kept separate is because they have different tax advantages, right? So my personal funds don't get near the tax advantages that my traditional or my Roth IRA do. I control them all, but they're separate investors. So sometimes when you're a syndicator, you might get two investors out of talking to the same person. So that can be a valuable tool. As a syndicator, I can often be able to, I may be able to produce better returns than people are seeing from all kinds of other products, financial products, especially ones that are very mainstream, because they're producing so little return in terms of interest rate and things like that. So often somebody has an old 401k or an IRA, they took it out of the stock market a while back and it's in something that's very conservative, and they might be making 1% or something like that. So two things are going on. One is the investor, if they're aware of that, it's got to be itching to be an investment that might produce something better. Second of all, as a syndicator, you might be able to say to them, hey, this project, these are what the financials look like, full disclosure, here's what we're doing. Do you think your IRA will do better in this than it would in the investment that you're in now? So that is often it's a remarkable thing that a lot of IRA and old 401k money is essentially on the sidelines, and which defeats the purpose of the tax advantaged account, right? So once you've made contributions to that account, it's the account holder's responsibility to get that money to make money, because that's how it's tax deferred, so it can compound faster than your personal funds. And so that's really the get. So I'll get off my soapbox there. But the last thing I'll also say about IRA investors is that it is the IRA account holder that makes that final decision, right? So there's not an advisor that necessarily needs to go through, although again, we recommend that you talk to your advisor about that. There's not a bank committee, there's not a SEC regulator involved. It is the IRA holder that is deciding, hey, is this project a good one, and does it work for me financially in terms of the dividends that it's going to produce or the returns it's going to produce, and the timetable of those returns, which can be different depending upon how old you are. So the fact that the IRA holder is the ultimate decision maker means that the person that you're talking to is the person that you need to be talking to, so that final decision can be made with that one person. So there are attributes of IRA investors that are slightly different than a person's personal finances, in as much as the timetable and things like that. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about IRA investors. One thing I'll mention here is UBIT. So often people, especially people who have been involved with syndications before and had IRA investors, is they'll say, what's UBIT? Well, UBIT is unrelated business income tax. It can come into play on syndications where there is debt leverage being used. And the only reason I bring this up is because as an IRA investor, you're certainly going to be, figuring out what your return on investment is going to be, and UBIT can come into play. And I'll say it like this. So UBIT comes from nonprofits, right? So Save the Whales, if Save the Whales has a thrift store and they're selling clothes, well, the IRS is happy to have anything that Save the Whales does that's directly related to whales, buying a boat or whatever. That stuff is all completely tax-free. But if they're running a store to make money to buy more boats, they don't want that store to be able to outperform every other store just because it's owned by Save the Whales. Save the Whales is probably going to sue me, so let's call it Save the Trout or something like that. But my point is that that's where these rules come from. It's about outperforming things. And so what it means is that if your IRA has certain types of investments where you're making money in a circumstance that the IRS doesn't feel like is a fair playing field, then your IRA has to pay some UBIT, unrelated business income tax. And when it comes to debt, it's this. So if my IRA purchases 10% of a syndication, and let's say that that investment is $10,000, but 10% of the project is not $10,000. 10% of the project is $60,000 or $50,000 because the syndicator is using debt, which is money that I never contributed to my IRA, obviously. My IRA is going to receive all the profits from the entire 60 grand. Yay. But a lot of that money I'd never had to contribute to my IRA, so it's not as tax advantaged as the $10,000 that I'm putting in it myself. So the net profit that is associated with the debt percentage likely will have UBIT at least considered, right? And so UBIT is a tax on the net profit that is associated with the debt percentage. And when you have UBIT or a possibility of that, your IRA actually files its own return. It's called a 990T. So all of my accounts have to do this. And basically what you do is you calculate the net profit that's associated with the debt leverage, and you may need to chip off a little bit of the profits that you made from that real estate investment and send it to the IRS. Now, this is your IRA sending that money to the IRS, not you personally. It's not on your 1040. None of this has anything to do with your personal finances. This is all the operation of the investment that's inside your IRA. UBIT is not a penalty. The IRS is not tense about it at all. It's really just a cost of doing business when your IRA is using debt leverage, and there are some other circumstances as well. But in the syndication kind of framework that we're talking about today, usually that's what's happened. The syndicator is using debt leverage. Your IRA is receiving funds or benefiting from the fact that you use debt instead of everybody being all cash. And so the net profits associated with that debt percentage may have some tax that you need to chip back to Uncle Sam in order to continue to invest that way. An interesting thing about this unrelated business income tax, as it relates to debt financed income, and that's what you see there on the screen. UDFI is called unrelated debt financed income. That is the incoming money that may have to pay UBIT. UBIT is the tax, UDFI is the income. But if you're self-employed and you have the ability to have a solo 401k, generally speaking, solo 401ks do not have to pay UBIT on UDFI. I know that's a lot of letters. But really what that means is that this tax that you might incur with an IRA that is invested in a syndication that uses debt, if your solo 401k is the account type that is investing in it, you may not have to pay any of the UBIT. So for self-employed folks, I always point that out because it's such an interesting distinction between an IRA product, whether that's traditional or Roth or SEP, versus a solo 401k. So again, just making you aware of these things. If you want more detailed information, ask a question at the end or contact me. I'm happy to, fill in all the blanks, but just understand that exists. This is really, I got a little ahead of myself. I already talked about it. So whatever the debt leverage percentage is, that amount of the profit is going to be considered for UBIT. Now you do get to, it's a net profit. It's not the gross income. So you can take the gross, chip away a percentage of the expenses, interest. You get $1,000 free per year from the IRS. You don't hear that very often. So all of those things are possible as well. So talk to your tax professional or somebody who is experienced at filing 990Ts to find out exactly what it would be. But that's the idea. You have a 990T, which is your tax filing for your IRA, and really all it amounts to is the cost of doing business using debt financing. It is taxed at the tax and estate rate, the trust and estate rate. And this is what it looks like in 2020. So, relatively modest earnings end up in that 10% bracket, but it does go up relatively quickly after that. But again, if your IRA investment that is using debt is paying a lot of UBIT, your investment is kicking butt. And you are making a ton of money from the debt. So it's important to calculate the cash on cash return, because even though it's going to be painful, at least it is in my case, I hate paying the IRS money, but it's painful sometimes to pay them. But that doesn't mean that you didn't make a great call on your overall investment return. So again, not a penalty, really just a cost of doing business. So I'm going to run through a scenario that's very common for us to see as an IRA provider, and then essentially I'll wrap it up and we're happy to take any questions. So Jane is our kind of test subject here. She has $100,000 in an IRA. It's at Vanguard, probably in some mutual funds and things like that. Good for her. It's fantastic. But she does like real estate investing. She meets Rocky. Rocky's putting together a real estate investment. And part of his prospectus on the investment is he's going to raise some money, and he's going to use that money to be a down payment, and then he's going to use debt, and we're going to say it's going to be 70% debt leverage. They're going to buy the property, and that's how the returns, and then the returns are going to come after that. So Rocky's going to fix up the property, and then away they go. So one of the things that Jane has to do in order to get her IRA money involved in this investment is to make sure that her IRA money is at a provider that handles these kind of investments. So like Advanta. And so, our process is basically she sends in an application, takes about 10 minutes. You can do it on DocuSign. It's pretty much a snap. That gives the money a place to go. You do a transfer from Vanguard in this case. That's not taxed and it's not penalized. You're just moving it from one custodian to another. And at that point, it's sitting in a cash position with Advanta. It's FDIC insured. And at that time, we're working with Jane to work with Rocky to get the investment documents together. So she opens the account, she transfers some money over, and then we will all work on the investment documentation. As I mentioned before, an IRA is its own legal and financial entity, and it is separate from the person. So Jane's IRA, not the same as Jane's personal funds. And you can see that Jane's IRA has another name, right? It's Advanta IRA, FBO is for benefit of, Jane Smith, IRA number, so on and so forth. And that is actually the investor that is listed on the documents. And this is the case no matter what your IRA is participating in. If it's going to buy a single family rental, it can, and the title holder is going to be the IRA. if your IRA is going to loan somebody money, the lender is that IRA. It's not you personally. So the documentation is very important because, again, this money has tax benefits that your personal funds do not. So you want to make sure that everybody's clear that it is IRA money that is participating, not your personal funds. So you can see that the documentation is the name of the custodian, FBO, the account holder's name, the IRA number for specificity. If there's going to be debt leverage involved, which there is in this case, it's a good idea for Jane's IRA to get its own tax ID number so that it can file a 990T for UBIT. I had to do that with all of my accounts, so they all have their own tax ID number. The other thing that's a little bit quirky about the way an IRA invests in a syndication is that the IRA custodian is actually the signer on behalf of the account. So the paper trail is a little bit triangulated. So in this case, let's say Rocky generates the investment documentation. It goes to Jane. Jane looks it over, makes sure it's the deal she wants. In the margins, but not on the investor line, she writes read and approved and signs it. And that lets us know that it's the investment that she wants. And then that paperwork comes to us and we actually sign it on behalf of the IRA. So an IRA is just a little mini trust that is operating on behalf of Jane and at her direction, but we are actually the signers of that as the custodian. So at that point, once we have the completed investment documentation and Jane's permission, she'll say, hey, send $100,000 via wire to Rocky's LLC or whatever his entity is to invest in such and such and complete the transaction. So we'll sign the investment documentation, send the money out of her IRA's cash position, and then, of course, all of the proceeds come right back into the IRA, right? So they don't go to Jane, they come back into the IRA's cash position. And at that point, it can be reinvested, right? So again, one of the great benefits of IRAs is that they can compound faster. So that money that comes back into the IRA can be reinvested and keep making more and more money, right? And that's the best use of that kind of thing, of that kind of account type. So that's really the mechanics. So the IRA money, it leaves the IRA's cash position, but it's never really technically outside the IRA. It continues to have that tax shelter. And the tax shelter also covers all the returns that come back via the syndication. And so just to reiterate, and I'm ready for questions after this. It's really just you fill out the account application. All you're doing is giving the notice to the IRS that you're going to have an IRA at Advanta who handles alternative investments. You fund that account. That can be transfers or rollovers. Rollovers are typically from old 401ks or old 403bs, 457s, things like that. Also not taxed and not penalized. They're just moving it over. You can still make contributions to your account at Advanta. Once the account is open and has some money, it's really the time for investment. So your IRA, you as the account holder decide what investment you want your IRA to make. We work on the paperwork to substantiate that is IRA money being used as the investor. Send the money out to close the investment and receive the proceeds, at which time they're ready to be reinvested. So that's what the mechanics of it look like. And again, I will stress the fact that this can be a paradigm shift for a lot of people. It's a much more proactive on the account holder's part, and the due diligence. Neither the IRS nor Advanta IRA does any due diligence on the syndicator. So it really is the account holder's responsibility to, talk to the syndicator, find out what the details of the deal are, and make sure that you do due diligence up to the point that you feel confident in the deal. All right, so we covered quite a bit of ground there, from account types to some IRS rules and some specifics about real estate investing and things like that. And I'm happy to answer any questions here on the presentation, or this is my direct dial office number and my email. So I realize that we went through it relatively quickly. So if you do have detailed questions or questions that come up later on, do feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk to you about it and give you much more detail about any of the things that we talked about.
Yeah, Clay, I have a quick question here that came in.
Yeah.
Basically, how do you get started setting up the 401k or a self-directed IRA in order to use that for your investment purposes in multifamily?
Sure. Well, it's an interesting thing. So first of all, some of the accounts like traditionals and Roths, those are individual accounts. So you can just open those up at a bank or brokerage house or Advanta. Any of those entities are fine, and start making contributions. Now, early on, when you're making contributions, sometimes the cash level that you have in them is relatively low. And so you might start them at a bank or a brokerage house where it can be in some low risk mutual fund until such time as you have a critical amount that could be invested in a different thing. That's not a requirement. We're happy to handle any amount of cash or investment amount. But that's the ground floor part, is you open up an account and you start to make contributions. By far and away, the more common thing that happens is somebody has a job, and at that job, the employer is sponsoring a 401k or a simple IRA or maybe a SEP IRA or something like that, which is a tax advantaged vehicle for you as the participant, as the employee, to make contributions. And so, but often you then move on to the next job. And once you do that, once you've separated them from employment from that sponsoring entity, it is actually eligible to be rolled over without tax and without penalty. So again, the much more common scenario is, well, I have 401ks at 2 jobs a couple of jobs ago where I no longer work, and they're just kind of sitting there. I want to get that money involved in something that's going to create some returns for my tax advantaged account. And so they'll open up an account with us, and they'll do rollovers of those and things like that. There are no limitations on the amount that you do rollovers or transfers to. The only limitations are the annual contribution limits, right? So you can only put in a certain amount of new money every year. But with these tax advantaged accounts, and it could be 401k, 403b, 457, 401a, thrift savings plan, defined benefit plan, defined contribution plan, almost any type of tax advantaged retirement account can be rolled over once you've separated from employment. And so that's really the thing that we see most often, is they'll say, okay, well, I know somebody who's putting together a real estate deal. I want to be a participant, and I have some old 401k money that's not doing very much. So they open an account, they do a rollover, and then they make the investment from there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
And then this next question says, what are the fees associated with converting from an IRA to a self-directed IRA with Advanta IRA, if any?
Sure. So unlike the revenue model for a bank and brokerage house, a custodian like Advanta, we charge based on our bookkeeping labor. So if we have to do some activity for your account, we generally will charge for it. So what that breaks down to is $50 to open an account. That's obviously a one-time only fee. When your IRA makes a purchase or sale of an asset, we need to register that in our software, as well as do some reporting about that. And so, so for a real estate syndication, if your IRA is going to buy into one of those, there's a $95 transaction fee when your IRA buys into it. And keep in mind that these fees that I'm talking about, they can come they can come from out of your IRA, but they can also be paid by your personal funds via credit card. It's the quirkiest, most arbitrary thing that the IRS allows that, but you don't have to pay your fees from within the account. You can, but you don't have to. Okay, so $50 to open the account, $95 to do the transaction. And then we do charge an annual fee, and that's for the ongoing bookkeeping, as well as we have to do annual reporting to the IRS. It's called the Form 5498. And every IRA is required to do that, to file one of those. So for that ongoing service, we have an annual fee. We have 2 ways that you can do it. We have a flat fee per asset, and then we also have a bracketed fee schedule where we just take into account the total value of your IRA and have a fee associated with whatever that dollar level is. And you can switch back and forth according to what's more economical for you. And without going into the fees for every bracket, I will say that the most common range for somebody to be paying us for annual fees is usually somewhere between $295 and $500. Now, that's not to say you might have an account where you have to pay more. You might have an account where you have to pay less, but I would say that that's kind of the middle thing. So $50 to open, $100, 95 to do the investment, and then possibly $300 a year or something in that range for the time that the investment is going. When we close out the investment, whether that's in the same year or 10 years from now, there'll be another $95, and again, that just buttons up the bookkeeping for the investment. And our website has a full fee disclosure. We don't want anybody to be surprised by our fees. Again, basically they're based on our bookkeeping labor, but that's a sketch of what it looks like.
I appreciate that. And by the way, Alex, that was a great question, and thank you, Clay, for answering that one.
Sure.
The next one, it says, and this is also from Alex, what are the options regarding converting an active 401k with a current employer to a self-directed IRA? And then he says, I assume this isn't possible since it hasn't been mentioned yet.
It's not impossible, but it is less likely. So a 401k plan is adopted by an employer, right? And so they are actually much more customizable than IRAs. And so what I would say, you do have the possibility of what's called an in-service distribution. And in-service is the key there. So I would go to your 401k administrator or the HR person at the company or whatever and say, hey, does our 401k plan allow for an in-service distribution? Meaning I'm still employed here, but the plan document may allow you to move some of that money out of the plan and it doesn't have any effect on your employment. It's usually not all of it, because the 401k plan provider usually wants to keep the cash. So not all 401k plans have that option, but some do. So that would be the question for a retirement plan at a company where you're still working, an in-service distribution.
In-service distribution. Perfect. Now, as far as a self-employed entrepreneur, if you will, would this person be able to purchase their own 401k? Is there a way for a solo entrepreneur to do that? And if so, what's the process?
Yes, great question. So a self-employed person, whether that's a sole proprietorship or an LLC or an S Corp or any of those, it doesn't really matter what the structure is, but if it's just one person, they can adopt a solo 401k plan. And that is actually a distinction that the IRS makes in terms of 401k plans. And the reason that they make that distinction is because it's only one person, you don't have to do the fairness testing and things like that other 401ks with multiple participants are required to do. So what you're looking to do is adopt a plan document and make sure that plan document that you adopt allows for alternative assets. So at Advanta, one of the things that we do is we have a custom solo 401k plan that people rent from us. It's $300 a year, it's flat. So $50 to get established in our system and $300 a year flat. And the reason that we rent it instead of sell it, so we could just sell that template to people. Attorneys do that. So we're not the only provider. Attorneys and even some other providers will have solo 401k documents that you can acquire. But the reason we do the rent is because anytime the legislation changes that affects a 401k plan, the plan needs to be what's called restated, which all it means is really just changing the documentation to reflect what the new legislation is. And all 401k plans have to be periodically restated, just reviewed to make sure that they're in compliance. So instead of selling you something and then making you do the restatement, we actually take care of the restatement. So when you rent our plan document, it is your 401k plan. So you as the self-employed person are the employer that adopted the plan. You also are the participant, and usually you name yourself the trustee. So you have a lot of roles in there, but The one thing you don't have to pay attention to is whether that plan document will stay in good standing with the IRS and the Department of Labor, because we will take care of that part. So when a person who is a self-employed person who wants to have a solo 401k, you are looking to adopt a plan document that is compliant with the IRS and the Department of Labor, so that you can be a participant and make those contributions that are allowable. But you want to, in this particular, what we're talking about today, make sure that that 401k document allows for alternative assets, or at least does not prohibit them. Because you can, as a self-employed person, buy a solo 401k document from Fidelity, but Fidelity's 401k document that you're adopting probably says you have to you have the only investments that are allowable in this particular plan have to be Fidelity investments. So you just want to make sure that you have the flexibility that you want in terms of assets.
Thank you for that elaborate answer. That was great. Very helpful too for not only myself, but a lot of solo entrepreneurs. So thank you for that one.
Sure.
Are there any other questions? We're going to give it a couple of minutes to see if there's any other questions. If not, we're going to get ready to jump into the breakout rooms. So I'm going to give you guys one more second here. Any other questions? And if not, we're going to jump into the breakout rooms. While we go into the breakout rooms, I'm going to go ahead and enter these questions here. It'll just be a little icebreaker, if you will. In this case, you know, when you do go to the breakout rooms, if you would just let us know your name, if possible, what city and state you're in. Okay. You know, just for an icebreaker purposes. And then what exactly are you doing in the multifamily space right now? So are you experienced? Are you here to learn? Have you done some deals looking to grow your business? So again, name, full name, city and state where you're coming from, and what exactly are you doing in the multifamily space? And I'll go ahead and try to put it in the chat box as well. But without further ado, guys, I hope you guys are ready. Let's go and jump into the breakout rooms. Here we go. Okay, guys, so that was our event for Multifamily Meetup Mondays. I was your host for this lovely event. Your presenter was Clay Malcolm. Wow, did he share a lot of great information. I hope you guys were taking notes because I just got a bunch of information on how to go ahead and start 401k for my LLC. So I hope you guys took notes. Looking forward to our next meetup. Hope you'll join us for our next Multifamily Meetup Monday, and I'll leave you with some of the information, contact info for myself. Please feel free to reach out to us. You have all my information on there. If you see toward the bottom right of your screen there, you'll have my full name, company, website address, and email and phone number as well. So that concludes our show. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you back here on Multifamily Meetup Mondays. Thanks again and have a great day, guys.